Good morning. Thank you all for joining this morning. We're really excited to have you here and at our last event for Black History Month 2021. Our goal this year with Black History Month was really to pull all of our community into the discussion on equity and inclusion and to make it more about celebrating people of the past or achievements of the past, but instead using those experiences and those stories to help each of us visualize a path for our own engagement and our own leadership. And we called it Leading from Where You Are. So thank you for participating in the activities that you may have and for being here today. I'll say that this work doesn't end just because February is over. So please expect to hear more from your colleagues throughout the year about ways to engage. Now, today we have the capstone event with a guest speaker in conversation with our David McCormick, and hoping again that you'll hear this and receive this discussion in a way that prompts your own self-reflection and your own action, because you can be part of the change. So let me introduce our guest speaker first, Dr. David Thomas. He's the 12th president of Morehouse College, the nation's largest liberal arts college for African-American men, since his appointment in 2017. He's a visionary leader after more than 30 years in higher education with a PhD in organizational behavior and several master's degrees as well from Yale and Columbia. Professor Thomas, or David, as we'll call him, formerly held professorships at Harvard University, HBS, Wharton, and was the former dean of my alma mater, Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. So I've had the pleasure of working with David in his capacity as an organizational consultant, which is work he's done for over 30 years as well, mostly related to organizational change and managing diversity in the workplace. And before that, I met him through a book that he co-authored called Breaking Through: The Making of Minority Executives in Corporate America, which is really an amazing study on minorities who've made it to the top and what it took. And so today, David will be in conversation with David about a range of topics, but we'll learn about his ascent to this leadership role as the president of Morehouse, as well as what he's thinking about, the obligation associated with that kind of leadership. And so I'll turn it over to David McCormick, and thank you for joining us. Oh, you can also put your questions in the chat. So we'll definitely save plenty of time for engagement and questions. So I'll be back to see you then. David?
Great, thanks, Melody. And Dr. Thomas, David, thanks so much for being here. I honestly can't think of a better leader to have for this discussion, and a more distinguished leader of a more distinguished institution in our country. So we're really glad to have you here. And there's so much to talk about. As we talked about yesterday, or when we had our pre-call, we want to go to a lot of issues and really get to some of the real challenging questions about how to lead in America today. And I wanted to start, though, having looked at your background and your success, maybe you could take us back to your family and how you grew up. And your parents, I understand, were educators, and just tell us how you went from that to and what that meant for you and sort of put you on your path.
Yeah. So first of all, it's a pleasure and an honor to be invited to speak to this group. Like many people who are familiar with the finance industry, I know of Bridgewater, and you guys' storied history and unique place in the financial landscape. So thank you for the invitation. Let me just make one correction. My parents weren't educators, but they were amazing supporters of education as a way for their 4 sons to move beyond their starting point. And I want you to interrupt me if I go on too long about my background, because for me, it's the most important and most interesting part of understanding who I am. I was once asked to to write a book about, my life. And I couldn't do it because I didn't think I had lived long enough. But I sent the publisher a title, and it was called An Improbable Journey. And at the time, I was the dean, finishing up being dean at Georgetown, and I labeled it An Improbable Journey. And the reason I did was I just sort of, I started with the room where it happened. I was born in 1956 in Kansas City, Missouri, to two parents, neither one of whom had finished high school. And Kansas City was a very segregated place. I was the second of four boys. And if you think about 1956, that's roughly 9 years after Jackie Robinson integrated baseball. It's the year that the Montgomery boycott, led by Martin Luther King, ended. At that point in time, the first Black graduate of Georgetown graduated in 1954. There had been no Black professors at the Harvard Business School. And so, you think about what one would have predicted as the arc of a working class kid born in a segregated community. You wouldn't have predicted the things that I've been able to do in my lifetime, the institutions that I've been able to go to and achieve at. And, I think there are two drivers of it. The first and most important was my parents, who, even though they didn't have a high school education, not to mention a college education, they sold me a story and I bought it. And that story was, you can do anything you want to if you're willing to commit to it. And the other was the civil rights movement. And so I grew up watching that movement evolve. As I said, the Montgomery boycott ended the year I was born. I can remember Martin Luther King coming to speak in Kansas City when I was about 7 or 6 years old. And everybody going to this big ballroom and listening to him. And I read about Martin Luther King. And the interesting thing about me being president of Morehouse is, when I was a little kid, couldn't have been much older than 9, I read about Martin Luther King, and my father had told me that if I didn't want to do what he did, then I needed to go to college. And my father always had 2 jobs. His second job was being a janitor at night. He would contract to clean buildings. He had 4 sons. So I started out at age 5 doing ashtrays, graduated to bathrooms, and I hated it. And he would say to me, "You hate this. If you go to college, you won't have to do this." And I said, "I don't know anybody who's been to college. I don't know what college is, but I know I'm going." I read Martin Luther King, went to Morehouse. So I decided at 10, I was going to go to Morehouse. And, you fast forward, when I applied to college, I only applied to 2 places. One was Morehouse. The other was a school I'd barely heard of called Yale, and I got into both. And Yale gave me a full ride, and Morehouse didn't give me any scholarship, and I followed the money. So it took me 50 years to get to Morehouse, but I finally made it. I was going to be a lawyer because watching the civil rights movement, I saw 2 professional classes that had college degrees: preachers and lawyers. And I knew I wasn't cut out to be a preacher. So I was going to be a lawyer because I thought they changed the world. And I got to college and I started looking at what lawyers really did. And I realized that they didn't do what I thought they did. And I discovered an area called organizational behavior, which was about organizational change and human development and leadership. And it spoke to me. And I pursued that path. And that's what set me, on a path to then go on to get a PhD in organizational behavior. At the time I started, I actually didn't think I was going to be a professor at a business school. Because the other theme I realized was, I wanted to be a lawyer because I thought lawyers changed the world. And what grabbed me about organizational behavior was it was all about change. And so, when I went to get my PhD in organizational behavior, I thought I would be some combination of an adjunct professor and a consultant. And, kind of one of those people who wrote books on the side or did research, and found my way to the Wharton School as my first job, and then on to the Harvard Business School for 20 years. And the great blessing of my life is that every day that I was, plugging away through the trials of becoming a tenured professor and all of that, every day I loved what I did. And, it was hard some days. I got beat up a lot of days. But by the time I woke up the next day, I was ready to go back and do it because I thought that I was doing something that would help change the world.
That's great. Getting beat up and coming back the next day, you'd fit into Bridgewater. We do some of that too. Let me ask you a couple things about that amazing story. One, I know there was a counselor, a student counselor, a school counselor that had some role in those early days. Tell us about that person in terms of encouraging you to go to Yale, but also are there others that you would point to in that career that said, wow, if that person hadn't existed as a mentor and source of encouragement, I would not be where I am today?
That's a great question, David. And there are several people. That counselor was, now mind you, the high school I went to only had one black family. Well, only had one white family. That's how segregated it was. All right. And this counselor was a Jewish woman who was my counselor my junior year, and she was about to retire. And at that point in time, there had only been 4 black men who had gone to Yale from Kansas City, and she had been the counselor for all of them. And I somehow wound up getting a scholarship to go study in France for my senior year. And so that put me on her screen. And she really wanted one more student to go to Yale before she retired. And she got to know my mother and fell in love with my mother and said, fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. And she invested in me. Also, my first mentor was my father. Just, an amazing father, amazing guy who just taught me fundamentals, just fundamentals, and about how to conduct myself as a person of integrity in the world. And then the way I found my way to organizational behavior was a guy named Leroy Wells, who was the first, and at the time, the only African-American who got a PhD from the Yale Organizational Behavior Program, where I got mine. I met him just before I graduated from Yale. And that gave me a vision of what I could do. And he really supported me. And then there's a guy who became my major advisor in my PhD program named Clayton Aldifer, who was a white guy who had adopted a Black son. And he taught me to be excellent with very tough love. You know, I would write a paper and he would say something like, you know, if anybody else wrote this paper, I would give him an A, but I can't grade it from you. I'd say, what? He'd say, yeah, you know, you can do better than this. Right? And what I realized was that few of my Black contemporaries who were getting PhDs at Yale had an advisor who believed in them. And it made a huge difference in my trajectory. Yeah.
I can see. And what was that like? I mean, you know, for most of your career, you've been one of few, going to Yale, Harvard Business School, Wharton. I mean, you know, you always had to be in the very, very small minority, maybe the first, but certainly the small minority in the room. And then on top of that, I know enough about academia to know it is cutthroat under any circumstances. So tell me about that rise. What did you experience? What were some of the challenges associated with it?
You know, so it was very, I'll show you the contrast. So at Yale, I felt valued. You know, that experience that I described with my mentor, I had that with some other professors, you know, the expectation that I could be what I refer to as that guy, right? You know, and my best, if I continue to make my best better every day, right, I can rise. I got to Wharton and they didn't value me, but I did very well there, right? But I always felt like there was some, you know, doubt about me. And it really came through when I got the offer from Harvard. And I had offers from Harvard and Michigan to leave Wharton. And I went to see the chair of my department and I said, hey, you know, just want you to know I just got an offer from Michigan and I think an offer from Harvard's going to come at the end of the week. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, I heard. I've got to go read your resume. Right? Like nobody was paying attention because in their minds, I was not that person who could get through the labyrinth that it takes to get through. And therefore, right, from a mentoring standpoint, I suffered benign neglect. And I think that's what happens to a lot of Black people in organizations who go in with tremendous talent, but nobody thinks that they're going to be that person, right? So it's not that anybody, you know, does anything negative to you, but they don't invest in you. It's benign neglect.
Yeah.
And you feel it as a kind of static. You know, I remember at Wharton giving a paper that became a very famous paper in organizational behavior. And I gave it, and it was at the intersection of what's become my work, race, leadership, and organizations, and how people develop in organizational context. And I gave the seminar, and at the end, these senior faculty members said, where are you going to publish this? And I basically named the top journal in the field, and they said they'll never take it. Well, they did take it. You know, and then I got to Harvard, and there I had mentors and sponsors who believed in me, but I still had to keep my own compass because they liked me so much that at one point, some of them told me I shouldn't do research on race because it was too risky, and they wanted me to get tenure because they really liked me.
Yeah. It wasn't the academic topic of the day that would ultimately put you on the right path.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the way I write about it, I try to write authentically.
Yeah.
So I don't dodge the issues. And I had written a paper called Mentoring and Irrationality, the Role of Racial Taboos.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's one of my best papers ever. But it was about how the legacy of slavery still impacts relationships between Blacks and whites in organizations.
Yeah.
And people thought it was stunning. And then my advisor said, hey, this is pretty, you can do lots of things. Maybe you should wait till you get tenure to do this.
Yeah, I got it.
And the good news was I realized I'm not an intellectual. I'm a guy who's doing what he thinks is important. And I have a set of skills I can apply to it.
Yeah.
Which is my ability to do analytical and theoretical work. And, study phenomena.
Yeah.
And if I'm not doing what I'm passionate about, I'm not smart enough.
Yeah, it's not going to work. No, I got
to do what will be acceptable at a level that will get you tenure at the Harvard Business School.
Yeah. I want to come back to your work in a minute and the relevance to us as we and other companies and institutions as we try to make progress on diversity, because I know you've got a lot to contribute on that. I want to go back to the benign neglect point, though, before we go further, because it seems to me, and there's so much we could talk about, so forgive me for skipping chapters and going right to Morehouse, but it seems like your current role is the opposite of benign neglect. You're consciously investing your great experience and your leadership to help build the next generation of African-American male leaders, Morehouse men that'll, be able to contribute to society. And I wondered if you could talk about that in terms of what are you trying to achieve from your current leadership platform, and why do you there's so many things you could do with your life, given who you are and what you've accomplished. Why did you choose this of the many things you could have done?
So there's two parts to your question. One is, what am I trying to achieve? And the other is, why did I choose to do this?
Correct.
I'll take the why did I choose to do this first, and try to make it a short answer. I had left Georgetown, gone back to Harvard, thought I was going to retire there, live, and being a tenured chaired professor at the Harvard Business School is, by any objective measure, the best job on the planet Earth, right? Like a monk or a priest, you have a job for life, but you can do all the things they're not supposed to do. And you get to do great things and other people pay for it. Right?
Pretty good.
And you get to study anything you want and think about it. It's a great job. And I went back and thought I would spend the last decade of my career there. I had just turned 60 and also had lots of things that I wanted to study and write about and speak to before I ended my career. And Morehouse came along shortly after I got back to Harvard. And, it had three elements to it. One is the romantic element. I wanted to come to Morehouse since I was 10 years old. The other was the element of what this institution distinctively does, which it has done for 153 years, which is create Black male excellence at scale. Right? And the best vision of it is May. You can go to 2,000 graduations. You can go to 20 graduations of the top liberal arts colleges in the country. And if Morehouse is among those, at those other schools, you will see 10, 20, maybe 30 Black men walk the stage. You come to Morehouse, you'll see 400. We produce Black male excellence at scale. And those young men have had an experience that has convinced them that they can defy the racial gravity of our country. And by that, what I mean is the racial gravity says it's not by accident that Black men are at the bottom of every index of well-being in our society: health, incarceration, income, right? You just go down the line of how you want to define well-being. We're at the bottom, right? And in some of those, we're a step above Black women, like pay. And these young men come out understanding that reality, but also believing that they can defy that gravity and that they can lift as they climb. And the other reason I came was the college had had some rough years. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that the combination of experiences that I've had would make me uniquely able to move the college at the rapid pace it needed to move, not to become a historical relic, right? Great place from the past, but not part of the future. And, my wife, I asked my wife one day, I said, because I've been with my wife since we were 16 years old. We started dating. So I said, what have you always thought about me? She said, you're fearless. And I said, no, I'm as scared as everybody else, but I never let fear hold me back.
Yeah.
I learned that from my father.
Yep. Back to the mentor.
Yep. So anyway, that's what got me here. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to create temperate radicals. Right? And that's the tradition of Morehouse. Men who can go out and be excellent at something in the world that has legitimacy. Martin Luther King was a minister, has legitimacy. Jay Johnson, former Secretary of Homeland Security, Morehouse grad. Lou Sullivan, former Secretary of Health and Human Services, right? Those are legitimate purchase, and they were excellent at them, but they were radical in the change that they wanted to make in those institutions. And so I'm trying to create tempered radicals.
I love it.
The Morehouse man thing, I'm not a Morehouse graduate. People talk about the Morehouse mystique and all of that. The way I think about it is, it's just creating men who are committed to excellence in their avocations and their vocations, and committed to leadership and service in their communities, their organizations, their families, and the world.
It's great.
And who believe that's what they should do and that's what they can do. Pretty simple for me.
It's great. It's a great mission. I'm sure we're gonna have people want to follow up on that. I've got 2 more questions for you before we open it up to the audience. And the first is related to your point around racial gravity that you referred to. And I wanted to go back to an op-ed that you wrote for the Washington Post, where you talked about the duality of America, where a Black man can be elected president and still have a very high probability of being pulled over by the local policeman, for no apparent reason. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, the state of that broader point, but also the state of race relations today in the country.
Yeah. Well, I think what it calls our attention to is that today we deal with Black people, or we continue. The way that the paradigm has shifted is that there's a dynamic of exceptionalism, right? By that I mean Barack Obama or David Thomas, when we see them doing their professional thing, we say, oh, wow, that's great. He's a Black male exception to the rule. So when we see that young man in that car, when we see Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot while jogging right here in Georgia, we don't think, oh, you know what? That could be the next Barack Obama. Because, we rule Barack Obama, or when people know who I am, right, as exceptions to the rule. And therefore, we don't apply that to that young man.
Yeah.
And there's a way in which that amounts to a devaluing of that humanity that's inside that person. So, we can have a George Floyd.
Yeah.
Right? 8 minutes on a neck.
Yeah.
Because we don't look down and think, oh, that guy could be whatever the best is that we think of, one evolving to. Good news, we can have Barack Obama. Yeah. The bad news is we still have the equivalent of lynchings happening in our country. George Floyd was lynched. Ahmaud Arbery was lynched. There have been several recent cases where, young Black men were shot in the back. Police said there was a gun. There was no gun. But the police got off. So that's what I'm referring to.
I got it. I know we're going to follow up on that in the Q&A. I'm going to take the liberty of one more question and then turn back to Melody. But it's really related to Bridgewater and to me and our journey here on diversity and inclusion. You've written so extensively about diversity within the corporate setting, what great leaders do in that respect. And if you were going to give advice, I told you a little bit about what we're doing when we spoke earlier, but I know you're not in any sense of the details of how we're thinking about it. But what would your advice be to an aspiring CEO who wants to tackle this issue head on and wants to make meaningful progress, but does, comes into it with some real humility?
Okay. So, I've been at these questions for 30 years. 20 years ago, I would have said, David, you got to be willing to commit, 40 hours over the next 6 months for me to work with you, help you understand this question. So right now, I'm going to give you 6 figures of consulting in 3 minutes.
All right. That's a deal.
Okay. And all you got to do is meditate on it. It boils down to 3 things: leadership, relationships, and alignment. Leadership is about applying ourselves to our goals and visions about diversity in the way that we apply ourselves to other issues that we think are important in our organization, that we think are important for our organization to be the best in class at what it does. And diversity is one of these issues that over the years, I'd go talk to a group, to a senior group CEO and his direct reports, and they would say, we're the best in the world at what we do. We only hire the best people. And then when they would start to talk about diversity, sooner or later, they would say, we're not any worse than anybody else. It's the only thing that they're willing to not be the worst on, as opposed to the best. And applying your leadership in that way, and also, using that like you would for any other issue in how you select your senior executives. If you've got a strategy that you're trying to implement, a business strategy, you're probably not going to hire a CFO who can't understand that business strategy, right? Or an HR person who doesn't understand, can't help you with that. So applying leadership. Relationships is about creating real and authentic relationships with people who represent the diversity that you want to affect in your organization. So most white executives, I used to do these analyses where I'd ask people about their networks. Who do you talk to when you're faced with a career challenge? Who do you talk to about, issues that are at the intersection of work and family? Who do you talk to? They would draw their network, and literally I'd give them crayons and they would draw the networks. They'd be up all over the room. Then I'd say, okay, go to the network and just mark the people who are different from you by gender. Mark the people who are different from you by race. And what you would discover is that most senior white male executives don't have very diverse networks. Therefore, they don't have any real authentic relationships with people who represent the dimensions of diversity that they're trying to impact in their organization. And so creating those authentic relationships, and what we discovered in our research, for example, in my book, Breaking Through, was that the CEOs who led those companies that were leaders, all for different reasons, had managed to create authentic relationships with people who represented the dimensions of difference that they thought were important for them to impact in their organizations. Whether it was women, racial minorities, people with disabilities, right? And so when you don't have those, you're not comfortable when you ask to hear from people from those groups. And you can't hide it. I think one of the great things that's happened since George Floyd, quite frankly, is that I've heard of and seen and been asked to advise senior executives about how to have authentic conversations and how can they model it so that they actually get, real conversation from folks. And they've all come back and said to me, I can't believe I didn't know.
Yeah.
Right? I can't believe I didn't know. And because they reached out, they also didn't do what I used to see happen, in the 90s, where African Americans and women would be asked to have an honest conversation with a CEO. They tell them honestly, And then the CEO would start into a conversation about why what they were saying wasn't real. Can't be that bad. Everybody wishes they had a mentor, right? Everybody here feels like they're suffering from benign neglect, which sends the message you're not different. Even though I asked you, how do you think your difference is impacting you?
Yeah.
Right? So building those relationships, and alignment is about the fact that we often have structures, practices, and processes in our organization that are designed to work against our intentions about diversity. Just start with recruitment, right? When I was at the Harvard Business School, I worked with a lot of top tier companies, and they were all about recruiting at Harvard University. And then they wondered why they didn't have any diversity. Well, I got 2,200 Black men sitting on my campus. And, you know, the one thing I'll say about all the schools I've been to or been affiliated with, Georgetown, Harvard, Yale, Penn, and Morehouse, is that all of the others have in common that they've produced at least one president, but we produced Martin Luther King. I think we're even.
Right.
Right. But they weren't recruiting here.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's about alignment. If you're aligned where you're only recruiting in places that are graduating onesies and twosies, and so is everybody else, surprise.
Yeah.
Nobody came to Bridgewater this year, but we made 6 offers.
Yeah, I got it.
Right. Likewise, you know, how we evaluate talent. A lot of highly selective organizations have these kind of up or out patterns, explicitly or implicitly. And what we know is that in the early part of one's career, the first 2 to 3 years in an organization, your first evaluation is a high predictor of your succeeding evaluations. So if your manager doesn't put you in the top 10, the likelihood that you can get into the top 10 subsequently is pretty low. What else do we know? First evaluations of racial minorities usually don't put any in the top 10 in most organizations. So what's going to happen?
Yeah, becomes self-fulfilling.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
What can you do different? No evaluations that place people in a distribution are given in the first 2 years. People give feedback, right? But nobody's locked in on the fact that David McCormick is an A player and David Thomas is a B player. What happens over time, if people aren't locked into that, is they start to see David Thomas's promise and maybe invest in it. That's one of the things that explains some of what we found in breaking through. But if everybody's already said David Thomas is a B player, we got to be committed to that.
Yeah.
Now, right, that's about alignment, and you got to be willing to change those things. So anyway, that's my take on it, and we can go where you want to go.
No, leadership, relationship alignment. I mean, there's a lot there. The problem for you now is that I know how to find you. So there, so I'm going to follow up. I've taken more of the time than I was supposed to, but I want to turn to Melody and the audience's questions. But thank you. I thought that was really phenomenal in terms of touching on a lot of what I had hoped to do. So thanks so much for that. And I look forward to hearing other questions from the audience. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. It was amazing. We have a lot of questions from the audience and a little bit of time, but I thought, as we all did, those nuggets you were sharing were worthwhile. I have a question that links to this, looking at my notes, this idea of creating tempered radicals and being part of change. what are some tangible actions that an employee at Bridgewater, for example, or another organization, or even someone who's still in school can do to promote diversity or maybe an inclusive environment? And then I want David McCormick to reflect on that as well, both your answer and that question.
Okay. Well, what was the theme you said? Leading from where you are?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. It's a great frame because it suggests that no matter where you are, you can lead. Right? And so the answer to your question is different depending upon where you are in the organization.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you start with the idea that we're not immune to the biases, conscious and unconscious, and the systemically caused inequalities that afflict most organizations in our society. We just start there, right? Mm-hmm. People come in with biases. Where can you start? You can start by questioning outcomes. You come into a unit and you're a new manager and somebody tells you, Melody, she does her job every day, but, she's not really, she's not an A player. And what normally happens is I would come in and I would say, okay, I trusted David. David told me Melody's not an A player. And so I treat Melody from the time I meet her like she's not an A player. Mm-hmm. As opposed to saying, you know what? I only want A players. I got Melody on my team. I'm going to treat her like an A player. Mm-hmm. And what do you do with A players? You don't dumb down their work.
Yeah.
You give them challenging work. What do you do with B players? You split the work up. You give Melody the A portion, mm-hmm. or rather you give Melody the B portion, mm-hmm. and you give Jane the A portion. Yeah. Because Jane's an A player. Well, no, I'm going to treat Melody like an A player. And I have seen people totally transform because somebody comes in and simply starts to treat them like an A player.
Yeah. That resonates.
Right? And that's not the CEO doing that. You can do that if you're a supervisor in the mailroom. Understanding how we can contribute to social isolation by who we invite. And, we're all going to lunch. We're a bunch of folks that, we're administrative assistants. We're all going to lunch. And we noticed that, David, he doesn't like to go to lunch with us. Well, just question that assumption. You know what? When was the last time we asked David to go to lunch? All right. And, as you move up to more senior levels, using your position and formal authority to make a difference, to enter into conversations. Most people get promoted not by the actions of a single individual, but by a conversation that gets created around them. Mm. We got to bring somebody in to run this bond desk, mm-hmm. Or to run this new business unit. And there are three people we're talking about. One of them is, a Latinx woman. The other two are white men. We start talking and conversations about who you put in positions usually have two potential sides to them. What's the upside to put this person in? What's the downside? What we know from research is that once the conversation turns to the downside about someone who's in the minority, the downside gets amplified. So that person becomes more risky. If I'm David McCormick, how do I manage that conversation? Because I'm hearing this happen. Melody's on the list. She looks great, right? And all of a sudden, though, our conversation about Melody is all about the downside. I can identify that and bring people back to the upside. Because the other part of the reality is, if I don't get some consensus about Melody, Melody won't succeed. So I can't just sit there and say necessarily, hey guys, this is all BS. I'm putting Melody in, even though, right, I got to bring them to a place where nobody can say this doesn't make sense. That's the reality. I don't know. I see on the, right, but that's my experience of how these decisions get made. And as a dean or president, I make them all the time myself, right? So there are these small things, matter of fact, I'm going to coin a new phrase. Some of you've heard of the phrase microaggressions, little things that happen that undermine people. There are micro-progressions.
Good. All right.
Right. And what leaders can engage in is micro-progressions. Right?
Okay. I want to
stop there. I know there are other questions.
Stop there. Remind people this was not ripped from the headlines, although it may sound particularly relevant for our organization. But David, I want to give you a chance to react to that.
You don't want to hear from me. I would say one word that I'm thinking and learning, which is empathy, which is the need to really systematically understand what it's like to be in the shoes of others throughout the organization. And I always thought I was an empathetic person, but I'm realizing over the last year or two, as we've thought about this, is the need to really be systematic about understanding what it's like through the eyes of others.
Right.
And that's doesn't come naturally. You have to really work at it. So that's my big reflection.
Okay. I'm going to try to merge together a couple questions. We had some folks talking about the idea of organizational change and organizational behavior, given your background. And we're in a place where, as you even described, no one was talking about diversity. No one was talking about the need for a more inclusive environment. And now we're here where everyone is talking about it. But how is has the process of change and the behavior around that actually changed, or it's just a topic?
Well, the answer is yes. My experience is the nature of the conversation and the engagement is different. It is different. And even people's willingness to move away from or to move toward talking about and using terms that, quite frankly, for the last 2 decades have almost been taboo, like race. And we moved to a point where we talk about diversity, but diversity becomes so homogenizing that at some level we're not talking about anything. Right? That's been the progression. Well, now, and even, and if I had stayed at Harvard, I'd probably be making a lot of money with a book coming out talking about how we've evolved now to, around diversity, right? We got tired of talking about hard topics. We went to diversity. Mm-hmm. Then we said diversity is sufficient. Diversity is necessary, but not sufficient. So we said, inclusion. Well, now we've slipped something in the middle that creates a different conversation called equity. Yeah. And that creates a dynamic that also has to have us confront issues of power and privilege. Right? Once you start talking about equity, you're talking about you have to engage what accounts for the inequities, power and privilege. Then that leads you to have to say, you know what? Not all groups are equal in their power and privilege, and that influences their ability to experience equity unless we are intentional. You know, I see more executives than I've ever seen in my life, you know, talk to me explicitly about racial inequity.
Yeah.
And use the word race.
Yeah.
Not what's wrong with Black people.
Stop it. Right.
You know, right? It used to be, you know, to the extent they would talk about race, it would be kind of like, Dave, let me pay you a whole bunch of money to come in here and give me an hour on what's wrong with Black people.
Yeah.
How can we fix it?
Okay. We there's so much here, and there were so many questions that we didn't get to because you were dropping knowledge left and right. So I appreciate you. Thank you. And let me hand it back to our David to close.
And that was fabulous, and we're really grateful for you being here. And you didn't really get enough of a taste of Bridgewater, so I'm going to try to convince you next time you're in New York to come up for a visit, and we'd love to spend more time talking to you. And it's really a privilege to get your views and your engagement on these issues. It's given us a lot to think about, and really, honestly, so grateful for your engagement with us. So thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Well, you know, it's been my pleasure, and I'm sure there are people in the audience sitting there thinking, he doesn't talk like a professor. He's just, you know, he's talking like we're just sitting at his house and he's telling us what he thinks. And that's only because David told me he wanted this to be a very authentic conversation.
I did, and it really was. So thank you, sir. Have a great weekend. Great,
Right.
Great of you all to participate. Thank you, and thanks again. Have a good day.
All right, thanks
Take care,
everybody.
guys.
Bye.